Hey man, there comes a point in a man's life where something quietly shuts off, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. It's the moment when he realizes that chasing connection has cost him more than loneliness ever did. That the constant emotional negotiation, the uncertainty, the pressure to perform, explain, reassure, and adapt has drained something fundamental from him. And when that realization hits, it doesn't explode, it settles, it hardens into clarity. And from that place, a thought forms that changes everything. It just doesn't matter anymore. Men aren't staying single because they hate women. They're staying single because they're tired of losing themselves, tired of relationships that require them to be emotionally available but mentally silent, tired of being expected to lead without authority, provide without appreciation, and stay calm while absorbing chaos. Somewhere along the way, the cost-benefit equation stopped making sense, not in theory, but in lived experience. And once a man sees that clearly, he doesn't argue with it, he adjusts. What most people misunderstand is that this withdrawal isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like rage, it looks like indifference. Men stop explaining, stop trying to impress, stop chasing clarity from people who thrive in ambiguity. They focus on their work, their health, their solitude. And for the first time, being alone doesn't feel like failure, it feels like relief. No emotional audits, no shifting goalposts, no unspoken expectations lurking beneath every interaction, just peace. This is why modern dating feels hollow to so many men. It's not the lack of options, it's the lack of meaning. Endless talking stages, endless tests, endless contradictions. Men are expected to be confident but vulnerable, dominant but gentle, ambitious but always available. And when they inevitably fail to satisfy all of it at once, they're labeled inadequate. After enough cycles like that, a man stops asking how to do better and starts asking whether it's worth doing at all. Staying single becomes an act of self-preservation, not avoidance, preservation. Because when a man steps out of the emotional marketplace, he regains control over his time, his energy, his attention. He no longer needs to decode mixed signals or manage someone else's internal conflict. His life becomes quieter, but also sharper, more focused, more honest, and that honesty exposes a truth most won't admit. Many relationships today ask men to sacrifice stability for stimulation, and some men are done paying that price. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath the surface. Men are realizing that intimacy without alignment is just emotional labor with a romantic label. That companionship without respect feels emptier than solitude. And once you've experienced the calm of not being evaluated, compared, or emotionally tested, it's hard to willingly step back into it. Singleness stops feeling like a temporary phase and starts feeling like a viable long-term choice. This doesn't mean men don't want love. It means they're no longer willing to beg for it, perform for it, or bleed for it. They want something simple but rare: consistency, peace, reciprocity. And until that shows up, not in words but in behavior, they'd rather remain alone. Not because they've given up, but because they've woken up. They've learned that attention is cheap, attraction is volatile, but self-respect compounds. What scares people about this shift is that it's quiet. There's no manifesto, no protest. Men are just opting out, building lives that don't revolve around romantic validation, investing in purpose, not potential. And when you remove desperation from the equation, the entire dynamic changes. Suddenly, relationships are no longer something to chase. They're something to qualify, and many don't pass. Women often sense this withdrawal too late. They notice men who don't pursue, don't react, don't compete. Men who are polite but unmoved, present but uninvested. And it feels unsettling. Not because those men are cruel, but because they're no longer hungry. They're not trying to win. They're not asking to be chosen. They're choosing themselves first. And that reverses a dynamic that many took for granted. So when men say it doesn't matter anymore, what they're really saying is this: I've found stability without chaos, peace without performance, and direction without emotional dependence. And once you've tasted that, singleness stops being a waiting room. It becomes a standard, a filter, a declaration that if someone enters your life now, it won't be because you needed them, but because they earned a place in a life that already works. What's happening now is that men are no longer confusing loneliness with lack. They're beginning to understand that being alone doesn't automatically mean being empty. In fact, for many, solitude has become the first environment where they can finally hear their own thoughts without interference. No emotional noise, no pressure to perform, No need to constantly negotiate how they're allowed to feel. And once a man experiences that kind of internal quiet, he becomes far more selective about what he lets disrupt it. He stops asking who can fill the space and starts asking who is worth sharing it with. This is why advice like "put yourself back out there" no longer lands the same way. Men aren't afraid of trying again. They're uninterested in repeating the same emotional patterns with different faces. They've learned that attraction alone doesn't build a life, and chemistry without character leads to burnout. The novelty has worn off, the illusions have cracked, and what remains is a grounded awareness that effort should flow toward things that grow, not things that constantly need saving. Another uncomfortable truth is that modern relationships often demand emotional exposure without offering emotional safety in return. Men are encouraged to open up, to be vulnerable, to share fears, only to find that those same disclosures are later used against them, consciously or not. Over time, men internalize a lesson they never wanted to learn. Silence is safer than honesty in unstable dynamics. So instead of hardening themselves emotionally, many choose to remove themselves from environments that punish transparency. Singleness then becomes less about avoidance and more about control. Control over one's emotional bandwidth. Control over priorities, control over direction. Men start structuring their lives around what they can build, not what they might lose. Work deepens, friendships become more intentional, health improves, and without the constant pull of romantic instability, progress accelerates. This isn't regression, it's consolidation. A man pulling his energy inward to strengthen his foundation. There's also a growing recognition that many relationships today operate on imbalance disguised as romance. Men are expected to initiate, escalate, stabilize, and maintain emotional momentum while being told that wanting appreciation or peace is insecurity. After enough cycles of that contradiction, men stop negotiating. They stop trying to explain why effort should be mutual. They simply step away. Not loudly, not angrily, just decisively. What people often miss is that men staying single aren't checking out of life, they're checking into it. They're learning skills, building bodies, stacking competence, creating leverage, and leverage changes everything. When a man's life feels full, connection becomes optional, not urgent. He doesn't need a relationship to feel chosen. He doesn't need validation to feel grounded. And from that position, desperation disappears, and with it, tolerance for dysfunction. This shift also dismantles a long-standing myth that men are terrified of commitment. The truth is simpler and harsher. Men are wary of bad commitment, commitment that costs peace, commitment that erodes respect, commitment that demands constant self-sacrifice without reciprocity. When men find commitment that feels stabilizing instead of draining, they don't run from it, they protect it. But until then, staying single is not fear, it's discernment. Culturally, this creates friction. Systems built on male pursuit and emotional labor begin to stall when men disengage. Dating apps slow down, social scripts stop working, and instead of asking why men are opting out, the narrative often shifts toward shaming them back into participation. But shame doesn't create desire, it creates distance, and men who have tasted peace rarely respond to guilt. There's a quiet dignity in this withdrawal. Men aren't announcing it, they're not arguing about it online, they're just living differently. Fewer entanglements, clearer boundaries, stronger routines, and when they do interact romantically, it's from a place of curiosity, not hunger. They're not chasing sparks, they're evaluating stability, and that evaluation is ruthless because they know what chaos costs now. So when you hear men say, "I'm fine on my own," understand the weight behind that statement. It's not resignation, it's resolution, a recognition that peace is rare, and once earned, it's not casually surrendered. Men aren't staying single because they've lost hope in love. They're staying single because they've found something just as valuable, a life that doesn't fall apart in the absence of it. What solidifies this choice for many men is the realization that peace is cumulative. Every day without emotional turbulence compounds into clarity. Sleep improves, focus sharpens, decisions feel cleaner, and once a man notices how much lighter life becomes without constant relational tension, he becomes protective of that state, not guarded, protective. He understands now that peace is fragile when shared with the wrong person and resilient when built alone. That awareness rewires his priorities in a way that doesn't reverse easily. This is also why men are no longer impressed by surface-level attraction. Beauty, charm, flirtation, they register, but they don't override discernment anymore. Men have learned, often the hard way, that attraction can coexist with instability. entitlement, and emotional volatility, and they're no longer willing to pay for chemistry with their sanity, so they slow down, they observe, they let time expose patterns, and when something feels off, they trust that feeling instead of arguing with it. Another shift happens quietly in how men relate to effort. They stop romanticizing struggle as proof of commitment. They no longer believe that love must hurt to be real. That suffering is the price of depth. They see now that effort without appreciation becomes self-betrayal, and loyalty without respect becomes obligation. So they reserve effort for places where it multiplies rather than drains, and until they see that multiplication clearly, they conserve their energy. Singleness also strips away illusion. There's no one to impress, no one to perform for, no one to blame when life feels empty or difficult. A man alone has to confront himself fully, his habits, his fears, his direction, and for many, that confrontation becomes the most honest relationship they've ever had. They learn what actually matters to them, not what they were told should matter, and that self-knowledge makes them far less likely to settle for connections that distract from it. What outsiders often misread as emotional withdrawal is actually emotional recalibration. Men aren't shutting down, they're tuning out noise, they're distinguishing between intimacy and intrusion, between support and dependency, and once that distinction is clear, they stop feeling guilty for choosing themselves. They stop apologizing for not wanting chaos. They stop explaining why peace matters. They simply live according to it. This recalibration also changes how men show up when they do date. There's less urgency, less tolerance for ambiguity, less willingness to carry conversations alone. Men no longer chase momentum, they look for alignment. If interest is mutual, it flows. If it isn't, they disengage without resentment. Not because they don't care, but because they refuse to invest in dynamics that require constant emotional guessing. Over time, this creates a noticeable divide. Some men continue chasing validation through relationships that drain them. Others step back, build quietly, and grow steadily. The second group doesn't look dramatic or exciting from the outside, but internally, they're anchored. They're not waiting for life to start once someone chooses them. They're living now, and that self-directed life makes them immune to pressure narratives that insist happiness must come from coupling. There's also a generational undercurrent here. Men are watching the outcomes around them: divorce, resentment, emotional burnout, and making calculations accordingly. Not cynical calculations, but realistic ones. They're asking whether modern relationships are structured to support growth or sabotage it. And when the answer feels uncertain, they choose caution over commitment, not because they fear intimacy, but because they respect the cost of getting it wrong. What this ultimately produces is a man who is no longer reactive to loneliness. He doesn't rush to fill it. He understands that loneliness passes, but bad relationships linger. He chooses temporary solitude over long-term dysfunction, and that choice, repeated enough times, reshapes his identity. He becomes someone who is comfortable standing alone, not because he rejects connection, but because he no longer needs it to feel whole. So when men stay single today, it isn't apathy, it's intention. It's the outcome of reflection, experience, and recalibration. They've learned that love should add to a life, not consume it. That partnership should stabilize, not destabilize. And until they encounter something that meets that standard, they're content to walk alone, not lost, not bitter, just clear. What many men discover in this phase is that independence reshapes desire itself. When you're no longer chasing connection to escape discomfort, attraction stops feeling urgent. It becomes selective. You're not scanning rooms for potential partners, you're scanning for peace, and that shift removes desperation from the equation entirely. You're no longer asking, will this person choose me? You're asking, will this person disrupt or enhance the life I've already built? And that question filters far more effectively than attraction ever could. There's also a hard truth men come to terms with. Modern romance often rewards emotional impulsiveness and penalizes restraint. Men who pause, who move slowly, who don't immediately invest, are labeled detached or uninterested, but instead of correcting that perception, men are letting it stand. They'd rather be misunderstood than emotionally drained, because being misread costs nothing compared to being entangled in a dynamic that erodes focus, confidence, and peace. This is why men are increasingly uninterested in explaining their intentions early. They've learned that clarity isn't something you announce, it's something you demonstrate over time. And when someone demands emotional transparency before trust has been built, men recognize that as pressure, not intimacy. So they disengage, not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly. They've learned that access to their inner world is earned, not owed. Singleness also removes the illusion that someone else will complete unfinished parts of you. Men who stay single long enough realize that no relationship can compensate for lack of purpose, discipline, or direction. And once that illusion dissolves, responsibility sharpens. They stop outsourcing fulfillment. They stop blaming loneliness on circumstance. They build structure, routines, goals, systems that don't depend on someone else's mood or availability, and that structure becomes grounding. What emerges from this is a man who no longer fears emotional distance. He understands that closeness without respect is hollow, and proximity without alignment is draining. He doesn't chase reassurance. He doesn't interpret space as threat. He knows that if connection requires constant emotional maintenance, it's already unstable. So he allows distance to reveal truth instead of rushing to close it out of anxiety. There's a quiet confidence that grows when a man stops tying his worth to romantic success. He doesn't need to prove desirability. He doesn't need to win affection. He moves through life focused on competence, contribution, and direction. And when romance enters that life, it's no longer a pillar, it's an accessory, something that can be enjoyed, but not something that defines him. That shift alone removes immense pressure from both sides. Women who encounter men like this often sense the difference immediately. There's no chase energy, no performative charm, no emotional bargaining. The interaction feels slower, calmer, more deliberate. And that pace exposes intentions quickly. Those seeking attention drift away. Those seeking stability lean in carefully. And the man doesn't force either outcome. He lets reality sort itself without interference. Men staying single also reflects a deeper understanding of risk. Emotional, legal, financial, and psychological risks are being weighed more soberly than ever before. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Men are asking whether the structures around modern relationships actually protect effort and reward commitment. And when the answer feels unclear, they choose restraint. Because restraint preserves optionality, and optionality preserves peace. This doesn't mean men are closed off forever. It means the door is no longer wide open. It's guarded by standards, not walls. By values, not fear. And those standards are simple but uncompromising. Respect, consistency, accountability, peace. Anything less isn't rejected with hostility, it's simply not pursued. That neutrality is what makes this shift permanent. It's not reactionary, it's resolved. So when men stay single now, they're not waiting for the world to change. They've already changed their relationship to it. They've stopped believing that partnership is the default path to fulfillment. They've discovered that solitude, when chosen intentionally, can be a position of strength. And from that position, every future connection becomes a choice, not a necessity. What deepens this resolve is the understanding that solitude is not an absence, it's an environment where a man can finally calibrate his nervous system without interference. Without emotional spikes dictated by someone else's expectations, without the low-grade anxiety of trying to maintain connection at the expense of authenticity. In solitude, he learns his own rhythms. He discovers how much energy he actually has when it's not being siphoned into uncertainty. And once he experiences that internal order, he becomes unwilling to trade it for companionship that reintroduces chaos. Men also begin to recognize how often they were taught to equate endurance with virtue, to believe that staying through confusion, inconsistency, and emotional imbalance was proof of strength, but endurance without purpose eventually becomes erosion. And once that realization lands, it rewrites a man's definition of masculinity. Strength becomes discernment, power becomes restraint, leadership becomes the ability to walk away without resentment. These are not traits rewarded by modern dating culture, but they are the traits that preserve a man's long-term stability. This is why many men stop engaging in emotional negotiations altogether. They no longer debate boundaries, they no longer explain why something feels wrong. They trust their internal signals enough to act on them quietly. And that quiet action, choosing distance, choosing space, choosing solitude, speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. It's not avoidance, it's alignment, a refusal to spend emotional capital where returns are unpredictable or consistently negative. Another shift occurs in how men interpret desire. They no longer chase intensity as proof of connection. They understand that desire can be loud and fleeting, while respect is quiet and durable. And when forced to choose between the two, they choose durability. That choice doesn't dull attraction, it refines it. It makes desire intentional rather than impulsive. And with that refinement, the need to constantly seek validation dissolves. Singleness also offers men something relationships often interrupted: momentum. Projects move forward without interruption, habits stabilize, identity consolidates. A man begins to see himself not as someone waiting to be partnered, but as someone actively building, and once that self-concept locks in, the idea of pausing or compromising momentum for an unstable connection feels irrational. He's no longer optimizing for emotional excitement, he's optimizing for trajectory. This is where many men realize they were never afraid of being alone. They were afraid of being still, afraid of confronting their own dissatisfaction without distraction. Singleness removes that distraction, and while that confrontation is uncomfortable at first, it becomes clarifying over time. Men learn what they actually want, not what they were conditioned to pursue, and that clarity makes them immune to external pressure to settle down before they're aligned. When a man reaches this stage, social narratives lose their grip. The idea that happiness requires coupling starts to feel outdated. He sees that fulfillment comes from coherence between values, actions, and direction, and when those align, loneliness becomes situational rather than existential. It comes and goes without defining him. He doesn't rush to eliminate it. He understands it as a signal, not a verdict. Women who encounter men like this often sense a boundary they can't cross with charm or emotion. There's no hostility, just limits, and limits change dynamics. They force honesty, they remove games, they clarify intention. Some women rise to meet that clarity, others disengage, and the man remains unaffected either way, because his center doesn't move with approval or rejection anymore. What's rarely acknowledged is that this movement towards singleness isn't isolation, it's recalibration at scale. Men are collectively reassessing the terms of engagement. They're asking whether the emotional, psychological, and structural costs of modern relationships align with the rewards. And when the answer feels uncertain, they choose to wait, not passively, but productively, building lives that don't require romantic participation to feel complete. So when men stay single now, it's not because they've closed their hearts, it's because they've opened their eyes. They've learned that peace is not something you stumble into, it's something you protect. And until a relationship can meet that standard without compromise, solitude remains not a fallback, but a position of strength. As this way of living settles in, men begin to realize that their emotional baseline has permanently shifted. They are no longer oscillating between hope and disappointment, excitement and anxiety. Their inner state becomes steadier, less reactive to external stimuli, and that steadiness changes how they interpret everything. A delayed reply doesn't trigger doubt. A cancelled plan doesn't spiral into overthinking. Silence is no longer a threat, it's neutral. And when your nervous system stops interpreting uncertainty as danger, you regain control over your choices. This is also when men stop internalizing rejection. They no longer assume that someone pulling away is evidence of their own inadequacy. Instead, they recognize incompatibility for what it is: misalignment, not failure. That distinction matters, because once rejection stops feeling personal, it loses its emotional charge. Men can disengage without resentment, without rumination, without the need to win the breakup mentally. They move forward cleanly, without carrying unfinished emotional business into the next chapter. Singleness gives men a rare opportunity to build identity without compromise, not a performative identity designed to attract, but an authentic one rooted in values, habits, and purpose. They ask themselves hard questions. What kind of man am I when no one is watching? What do I want my days to look like? What am I building toward? And as those answers solidify, the need for external validation weakens, approval becomes optional, direction becomes internal. What follows is a sharpening of priorities. Men become ruthless about how they spend time and energy. Distractions lose their appeal. Shallow connections feel hollow. They invest deeply in fewer things instead of superficially in many. And because they're no longer splitting attention between emotional management and personal growth, progress accelerates. Goals once delayed by relational drama suddenly feel achievable. Momentum replaces stagnation. This is where the cultural misunderstanding grows widest. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal or disengagement, but internally, it feels like expansion. Men aren't shrinking their lives, they're consolidating them. They're choosing depth over breadth, clarity over chaos. And when you live this way long enough, you stop feeling the need to justify it. You don't argue your case, you don't defend your choices, you simply live them. Men also become more aware of how often emotional intimacy was confused with emotional obligation. In past relationships, care often turned into responsibility for someone else's feelings. Singleness breaks that pattern. It teaches men that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice, and support doesn't require self-erasure. They learn to be kind without being consumed, and that lesson alone prevents countless future entanglements that would have drained them. As this internal structure strengthens, men stop fearing permanence. Being single no longer feels like a temporary condition waiting to be fixed. It becomes a stable state that can last as long as it needs to. And that stability removes pressure from future connections. There's no rush to define, secure, or lock anything down. Relationships, if they happen, unfold slowly, without urgency, without fear of loss, without clinging. Women who cross paths with men in this state often sense that they are optional, not central. And while that can feel unsettling at first, it also creates a rare opportunity for genuine connection. There's no pedestal, no emotional leverage, no dependency, just two people meeting as individuals with complete lives. Some find that refreshing, others find it uncomfortable. And again, the man doesn't intervene. He allows reality to sort itself. What becomes undeniable is that men staying single are not waiting for permission to live fully. They're not paused. They're not incomplete. They're actively shaping lives that feel coherent, grounded, and self-directed. Romance, when it enters, is evaluated against that foundation, not placed above it. And anything that threatens to destabilize it is declined without hostility or regret. So when men choose to stay single, it's not a rejection of love, it's a refusal to abandon themselves. It's the outcome of experience teaching clarity, of peace becoming non-negotiable, of identity becoming solid enough to stand alone. And from that place, any future relationship must meet a simple requirement. It must add to a life that already works, not ask to be the thing that makes it work. What ultimately locks this path in place is the realization that emotional independence doesn't make a man colder, it makes him clearer. Clear about what he wants, clear about what he won't tolerate, clear about the difference between connection and distraction. When that clarity arrives, it rewires instinct. He no longer chases what excites him momentarily. He evaluates what sustains him over time, and that shift removes urgency from his decisions. Urgency is replaced by intention, and intention creates lives that don't wobble when someone leaves. Men also begin to see how much emotional confusion was once normalized as romance. Mixed signals were framed as mystery, inconsistency was framed as passion, anxiety was framed as chemistry. Singleness strips those labels away, it exposes the cost beneath them. And once a man recognizes that anxiety is not attraction and instability is not depth, he stops romanticizing emotional turbulence. He chooses clarity, even when clarity feels less thrilling, because thrill fades, but stability compounds. There's an internal recalibration that happens when no one is monitoring your choices, no one evaluating your desirability, no one subtly shaping your behavior through approval or withdrawal. A man begins to act according to his own compass instead of external feedback. He eats differently, sleeps differently, trains differently, builds differently, and over time that self-directed momentum becomes addictive. It feels clean, honest, unfragmented, and once you've experienced life without fragmentation, it's hard to go back. This is also where men stop confusing availability with generosity. They realize that always being reachable was never kindness, it was lack of boundaries. Singleness teaches them how to give without overextending, how to care without losing center, how to listen without absorbing chaos. These skills don't disappear when relationships return, they refine them. And because those skills were earned in solitude, they can't be taken away by someone else's expectations. Another shift appears in how men relate to disappointment. When you're no longer hinging happiness on romantic outcomes, disappointment loses its sting. Plans falling apart don't derail you. Interest fading doesn't destabilize you. You don't take it personally, you take it accurately, and accuracy creates peace. It allows you to respond instead of react, to disengage instead of argue, to move forward without dragging emotional weight behind you. Men staying single also begin to appreciate how much emotional bandwidth was once spent managing impressions. How am I coming across? Did I say the right thing? Am I being interesting enough? That mental noise disappears in solitude, and in its place comes depth, focus, presence. You become more absorbed in what you're doing than in how you're perceived. And paradoxically, that absorption makes you more grounded and compelling without you trying to be. This is where identity solidifies, not an identity built to attract, but one built to endure. A man becomes someone he respects, not someone he hopes others will approve of, and that self-respect changes everything. It informs decisions quietly, it filters environments naturally, it creates a baseline that doesn't fluctuate with praise or rejection. From that baseline, relationships are no longer auditions, they're invitations. Women who meet men in this state often sense something uncommon. There's no rush, no emotional hunger, no underlying agenda, and that absence of agenda changes the dynamic entirely. Conversations slow down, masks drop faster, compatibility reveals itself without pressure, and if alignment isn't there, separation feels clean rather than traumatic. No chasing, no resentment, just recognition. What's emerging, slowly but unmistakably, is a generation of men who no longer equate adulthood with romantic attachment. They define maturity through self-governance, emotional regulation, and purpose. They measure success by coherence, not coupling. And while this challenges long-standing social expectations, it reflects a deeper truth. A man who can stand alone is not rejecting connection, he's redefining it. So when men continue to stay single, it's not because they've closed the door, it's because they've built a house worth protecting. A life with rhythm, direction, and peace. And anyone who enters that life must move with that rhythm, respect that direction, and preserve that peace. Until then, solitude isn't a void to escape, it's the ground on which everything solid is built. As men settle deeper into this way of living, they begin to notice that their emotional reactions have slowed down in a way that feels almost unfamiliar. Things that once would have triggered frustration, jealousy, or self-doubt now pass through them with far less resistance. Not because they've numbed themselves, but because they've stopped attaching meaning where it doesn't belong. They no longer assign value to every glance, every message, every shift in tone. And that restraint isn't suppression, it's discernment. It's knowing that not everything deserves access to your inner world. This emotional steadiness changes how men experience attraction itself. They still feel it, but it doesn't hijack their judgment. Desire no longer overrides reason. Interest doesn't silence intuition. A man can acknowledge chemistry without surrendering to it, and that ability to feel without being led becomes one of the most underrated forms of strength, because it allows him to remain present without becoming entangled, curious without becoming compromised. Singleness also teaches men how much of their previous emotional pain came from expectation, not reality, from hoping someone would be consistent, from believing potential would turn into effort, from trusting words over patterns. When those expectations fall away, suffering diminishes, life becomes simpler, not easier, but cleaner. There's less internal debate, less self-blame, less confusion, and that simplicity frees up mental energy that was once trapped in unresolved emotional loops. Another quiet shift takes place in how men view companionship. It stops being a solution and starts being a supplement, something that can enhance an already solid life, but never something required to make life feel meaningful. That reframing removes pressure from both sides. There's no need to rush intimacy, no need to force compatibility, no need to cling to something that doesn't fit, and when companionship does occur, it feels lighter, less loaded with expectation, more grounded in mutual presence. Men also begin to recognize how often silence was their greatest teacher. In the absence of constant communication, truth emerges. You see who reaches out with intention and who disappears without explanation. You see who values consistency and who thrives on unpredictability. And instead of chasing clarity, you allow time to reveal it. That patience protects you from investing in narratives that feel exciting but collapse under scrutiny. This period of singleness often produces a man who is far more comfortable with himself than he ever was in a relationship. He's no longer defining his worth through someone else's desire. He enjoys his routines, his solitude, his progress, and because his life feels full, he's not tempted to fill space with people who don't align. That fullness becomes the filter. Anyone who adds friction rather than value is gently, effortlessly excluded. What surprises many men is how this state doesn't make them isolated. It makes them selective. They don't withdraw from the world, they engage with it more intentionally. Friendships deepen, conversations become more meaningful, there's less noise and more signal, and in that environment, connection feels earned rather than forced, authentic rather than performative. Women who encounter men like this often sense a shift they can't quite name. There's no chasing energy, no emotional volatility, no neediness hidden beneath confidence, just presence, and presence without expectation feels rare. It creates a different dynamic, one where attraction grows slowly, where trust isn't rushed, where reality isn't avoided. Some women rise into that space, others retreat from it, and the man lets both happen without interference. Over time, men realize that staying single isn't a statement, it's a consequence, a natural result of valuing peace, clarity, and self-respect over social pressure and romantic narratives. They're not proving anything, they're not making a point, they're simply living in alignment with what they've learned, and alignment, once established, doesn't require explanation. So when men continue walking this path, it's not because they've become indifferent to connection, it's because they've learned the cost of misalignment. They understand now that not every opportunity is worth taking, and not every relationship is worth sustaining. And until something arrives that meets them at their level of clarity, steadiness, and purpose, they remain content where they are, grounded, self-directed, and at peace. What becomes unmistakable at this stage is that men are no longer negotiating with social expectations. The old script, date, commit, settle, sacrifice, no longer carries authority. Not because it's wrong in every case, but because it was presented as mandatory rather than conditional. Men are now treating relationships the way they treat every other serious investment in life, with caution, analysis, and a clear understanding of risk versus reward. And once romance is removed from the realm of fantasy and placed into the realm of reality, many men simply decide the timing, structure, or cost no longer makes sense for them. This is where emotional detachment turns into emotional sovereignty. Men are no longer handing the steering wheel of their inner world to someone else. They don't allow attraction to dictate behavior, they don't allow loneliness to dictate decisions, and they don't allow guilt to dictate commitment. That sovereignty creates a quiet confidence, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the stable kind that doesn't need it. A man like this doesn't seek permission to live the way he chooses. He chooses first and explains later, if at all. Men also begin to notice how much peace comes from not being evaluated constantly. No silent comparisons, no shifting standards, no unspoken test, disguised as conversation. Singleness removes the feeling of always being on trial, and that relief is profound. It allows a man to relax into who he is instead of constantly adjusting who he's supposed to be. Once that tension is gone, it's difficult to justify re-entering situations that recreate it without offering something truly meaningful in return. Another subtle but powerful change is how men redefine success. It stops being about social proof, who they're with, how they're perceived, whether they meet cultural milestones on schedule. Success becomes internal alignment, waking up without dread, moving through days with purpose, ending weeks with progress instead of regret. And when those markers replace external validation, the pressure to couple for appearances disappears entirely. Men staying single also learn to trust delayed gratification in a way they never had to before. They're no longer chasing immediate emotional comfort. They're willing to sit with discomfort if it protects long-term stability. And that patience spills into every area of life. Career, health, friendships, discipline strengthens, focus sharpens, and the man who can delay gratification emotionally becomes far harder to manipulate romantically. What often shocks men is how little they actually miss once the emotional noise fades, the drama, the uncertainty, the endless decoding. They realize that much of what they called connection was actually stress normalized by repetition. And once stress is removed, clarity takes its place. That clarity doesn't shout, it whispers, it guides decisions quietly, and men who listen to it stop repeating cycles they once felt trapped inside. This is also the point where men stop arguing with reality altogether. They no longer try to convince someone to value them correctly. They no longer explain why consistency matters. They no longer chase mutual effort. They observe, they decide, they move accordingly. And that simplicity creates emotional efficiency. No wasted conversations, no prolonged ambiguity, no lingering hope in places where patterns have already spoken. Women who encounter men in this state often feel something unfamiliar. They can't rush him, pressure him, or emotionally corner him. He's open, but not pliable, kind, but not compliant, interested, but not dependent. And that balance either inspires respect or exposes incompatibility immediately. There's no prolonged confusion. Reality asserts itself early, and that saves both sides from months or years of misalignment. Over time, men realize that staying single isn't about rejecting women. It's about rejecting chaos, rejecting confusion, rejecting dynamics that demand emotional output without emotional return. And once a man has lived without those drains, he doesn't feel like he's missing out. He feels like he's opted into something better: stability, agency, and a life that moves forward regardless of who enters or exits it. So when men say it just doesn't matter anymore, what they mean is that desperation has died, fear has loosened its grip, and clarity has taken its place. They are no longer waiting for permission to be at peace. They've claimed it, and from that place, relationships are no longer a goal, they're a possibility, one that must earn its way into a life that is already full, already directed, and already standing on solid ground.